Just a couple recap reminders. We have talked about the big picture of Genesis and how we are waiting for this promised royal descendant who's going to become a blessing to the nations. That was a promise that was given to Abraham back in Genesis 12 and 15 and 17. And we started to see maybe a little bit of that last week in Joseph as all of the nations are coming to him and are buying grain from him in this time of famine. But there are threats that also run through the entire book of Genesis, threats to this promised descendant that is going to come. So one of those that we've seen repeatedly is fraternal conflict. You see that from Cain and Abel, and to Shem, Ham, and Japheth, Noah's sons. You see it with Ishmael and Isaac and Jacob and Esau. And then we saw it at the beginning of the Joseph narrative with Joseph's brothers and Joseph. This week we're going to see it flipped a little bit with Joseph's brothers and Joseph once again. The other threat that we have consistently seen in Genesis is famine. So we've had already two times that first with Abraham and then with Isaac, they have faced famine in the land of Canaan. Abraham goes down to Egypt to find food during the famine. Isaac starts to go down to Egypt, but then God says, don't go down to Egypt, and he doesn't, but God provides for him. And then we're going to see that here the famine actually hits with Jacob's family and Jacob's brothers. So just another reminder too, as we talk about the Joseph narrative, this is the sons of Jacob narrative. And the sons of Jacob have been a little bit in the background for a while now since selling their brother into slavery, but now they come back into the forefront of the story. So we're going to be back with all of the sons of Jacob once again. And we pick up with Joseph in charge in Egypt. He's selling grain in the midst of all this famine, and all the world is coming to him to avoid this starvation. So we're going to start in Genesis chapter 42, and let's just read a few verses of Genesis 42. Let's start in verse 1. It says, when Jacob learned that there was grain for sale in Egypt, he said to his sons, why do you look at one another? I love that verse. I don't know why. I think it's just, what are you doing? Just go. And he said, behold, I have heard that there is grain for sale in Egypt. Go down and buy grain for us there, that we may live and not die. So 10 of Joseph's brothers went down to buy grain in Egypt. But Jacob did not send Benjamin, Joseph's brother, with his brothers, for he feared that harm might happen to him. Thus the sons of Israel came to buy among the others who came, for the famine was in the land of Canaan. So Jacob sends his sons, but who does he hold back? He holds back Benjamin. Benjamin's the youngest one, and whose son is Benjamin? Rachel's. So just like Joseph, Benjamin is a son of the woman that Jacob actually loved in the first place. And he's Jacob's youngest son at this point. So you see sort of that favoritism and that caring more for the sons of Rachel still happening with Jacob. He's holding Benjamin back because he doesn't want anything to happen to Benjamin. And remember also, Rachel died either in childbirth or shortly after Benjamin was born. So Benjamin is all that Jacob has left of Rachel, of this woman that he loved. And so he is holding on tight to Benjamin, and he is not about to let him go and be put in harm's way. I want to point out, I didn't look up what the actual distance is, but the distance from Canaan to Egypt is a long way. Like it's not, hey, hop over, take a day or two trip and get there. This is a long journey and a dangerous journey that he's sending these brothers on. So even later, whenever he sends them back to Egypt, it's not like, oh yeah, just hop on down to Egypt. This is a big deal for them to make a journey down to Egypt, and he's not willing to put Benjamin through that difficult journey. Let's look at verse 6. It says, now Joseph was the governor over the land, and he was the one who sold to all the people of the land. And Joseph's brothers came and bowed themselves before him with their faces to the ground. Joseph saw his brothers and recognized them, but he treated them like strangers and spoke roughly to them. Where do you come from? He said. And they said, from the land of Canaan to buy food. And Joseph recognized his brothers, but they did not recognize him. And Joseph remembered the dreams that he had dreamed of them. And he said to them, "You are spies. You have come to see the nakedness of the land." They said to him, "No, my lord, your servants have come to buy food. We are all sons of one man. We are honest men. Your servants have never been spies." So the brothers come down to Egypt, and the first thing we see is the brothers bow to Joseph, just like the dream said. Now, remember, when Joseph was interpreting Pharaoh's two dreams, he said that the dreams were doubled, and what that meant is that this thing was sure to come about soon. The famine and the years of plenty and the years of famine were sure to come about. And we remembered last week that Joseph had these two dreams that were doubled, and it's almost to say, like, this was going to come about. This was God's plan, that Joseph's brothers were going to bow to Joseph. And here it is actually coming about. And so this is, again, pointing back to the royal identity of Joseph, and that Joseph is coming and at least partially fulfilling this promise that we have of a royal descendant of Abraham. And that's not going to be fully fulfilled in Joseph, but it is pointing to that. And then there's a tension here that is reintroduced, this time by Joseph. You have the fraternal conflict, the conflict between brothers comes back here, but this time the tables are turned, right? Joseph is the one that's in charge, and Joseph is the one that can make things go badly for his brothers. And if you read this just not knowing anything about the story, it might be really concerning to say, oh no, Joseph has every power now to just wipe these brothers out. He could just take them out. But obviously that's not what is going to happen here. Instead, what Joseph does is he tests his brothers. It says that he speaks roughly with them and he accuses them. The Bible isn't super clear right here about Joseph's intentions. Is he just being a jerk because they were jerks to him? I don't think that is the point of it. He was the guy that was rubbing his dreams in his brothers' faces back then. But I think other than that, we really don't see anything negative about Joseph. So I don't think he's just being a jerk here. I think what we're seeing is he is testing his brother's character. He's prodding his brothers a little bit to see who these guys are now. Remember, this is something like 22 years later after they sold him into slavery. So he's testing them now and seeing what kind of men they've become. And he's going to test them the same way that they were tested before, the same way they were tested with Joseph himself. He's going to test them with his younger brother. So if you look in verse 12, well, they go back and forth a little more from 12 to 17. And what he ends up doing is he ends up putting them in prison. But then he brings them out of prison on the third day, which is verse 18. It says, "On the third day, Joseph said to them, 'Do this and you will live, for I fear God. If you are honest men,'" with just a note, them saying that they are honest men, Joseph is probably like, time out. I know you're not spies, but honest men, like let's test and see if you're actually honest men. So verse 19, "If you are honest men, let one of your brothers remain confined where you are in custody, and let the rest go and carry grain for the famine of your households. And bring your youngest brother to me, so your words will be verified, and you shall not die.' And they did so. Then they said to one another, 'In truth, we are guilty concerning our brother, in that we saw the distress of his soul when he begged us, and we did not listen. That is why this distress has come upon us.'" So it's really interesting. You start to see the guilt come back on his brothers, and they are feeling that, okay, justice is going to come around to us. We are now going to reap what we've sown, and they see the justice of God as something that is going to be handed down no matter what, and they are recognizing, oh no, like we're about to receive the justice of God for this. But interesting what goes on in verse 22. "Reuben answered them, 'Did I not tell you not to sin against the boy? But you did not listen. So now there comes a reckoning for his blood.' They did not know that Joseph understood them, for there was an interpreter in between them. And then he turned away from them and he wept. And he returned to them and spoke to them. He took Simeon from them. Simeon is the second born, so he didn't take Reuben. He took the next one down, who is Simeon, and bound him before their eyes. And Joseph gave orders to fill their bags with grain and replace every man's money in his sack to give them provisions for the journey. And this was done for them. So Joseph, on the one hand, you see him take Simeon. Now one of their brothers is being put in prison. On the other hand, you see him provide for his brothers. He gives them the grain that they need. And not only that, he goes above and beyond, but he takes the money that they paid for the grain and he puts it back in the bags that they have the grain in. Now, the brothers, whenever they find that they have this grain, they don't take it as a positive thing. They say down in verse 28, he said to his brothers, "My money has been put back. Here it is in the mouth of my sack." And their hearts failed them. And they turned trembling to one another, saying, "What is this that God has done to us?" So they're thinking, we're in big trouble because it's going to look like we've stolen this money back from Joseph. But it's also interesting here. Again, who do they point back to? They say, God has done this to us. And I think they're still in this mindset. God is about to judge us for what we did to Joseph. And their guilty hearts are still feeling that judgment that they believe is going to come for how they've treated their brother. So they go back and they tell everything to Jacob. I'm not going to read all of it because they just kind of reiterate it. But in verse 36, we do see Jacob reveals his bitterness towards these sons. Jacob has not gained a more positive view of his sons at all. In 36, it says, Jacob, their father, said to them, "You have bereaved me of my children. Joseph is no more, and Simeon is no more. And now you would take Benjamin. All this has come against me." And he is not about to let them take Benjamin now to go back and get Simeon. Now, poor Simeon just is there in prison in Egypt, and he doesn't know anything that's happening. And what happens next, Reuben says to his father in verse 37, "Kill my two sons if I do not bring him back to you. Put him in my hands, and I will bring him back to you." But Jacob said, "My son shall not go down with you, for his brother is dead, and he is the only one left. If harm should happen to him on the journey that you are to make, you would bring down my gray hairs with sorrow to Sheol." So for some reason, Jacob's not comforted by Reuben saying, "I'll kill my two sons if I don't bring," like he's not comforted by that. And he doesn't trust Reuben at all at this point. And so Simeon is just stuck, and they stay there in Canaan until they run out of food. And Simeon is just staying there in the prison until they run out of food. And he has no idea what is going on, has no idea what is happening there. But eventually they have no choice because of the severity of the famine in the land. They run out of food. They're all going to die if they don't go back down to Egypt. So then in chapter 43, you notice they're trying to convince Jacob about Benjamin, and Reuben comes forward, this firstborn who ought to have the ear of his father. He comes forward and he does not convince him. Jacob is not about to listen to him. But then look at what happens in chapter 43 and verse 2. When they had eaten the grain that they had brought from Egypt, their father said to them, "Go again, buy us a little food." But Judah said to him, "The man solemnly warned us, saying, 'You shall not see my face unless your brother is with you. If you will send our brother with us, we will go down and buy you food. But if you will not send him, we will not go down. For the man said to us, you shall not see my face unless your brother is with you.'" So now it's not Reuben standing up, it's Judah standing up. And whether it's because it's Judah versus Reuben or because they're just a lot more desperate now, Jacob starts to listen to Judah in a way that he didn't listen to Reuben. So Israel says, and it's interesting if you follow in this account when it calls Jacob Jacob and when it calls him Israel. Some commentators say it points to how Jacob is being perceived as the head of a larger household when he's called Israel, and Jacob himself is being referred to as just a more individual. This is Jacob saying this. Either way, it does go back and forth between calling him Israel and Jacob. But he says in verse 6, "Why did you treat me so badly to tell the man that you had another brother?" And they replied, "The man questioned us carefully about ourselves and our kindred, saying, 'Is your father still alive, and do you have another brother?' What we told him was in answer to these questions. Could we in any way know that he would say, 'Bring your brother down'?" And Judah said to Israel his father, "Send the boy with me, and we will arise and go, that we may live and not die, both we and you, and also our little ones. I will be a pledge of his safety. From my hand you shall require him. If I do not bring him back to you and set him before you, then let me bear the blame forever. If we had not delayed, we would have now returned twice." So Judah is now... Reuben offered the lives of his sons as a surety for Jacob, and Jacob was not interested in that. Judah now here offers himself and says, "My life is going to be payment for Benjamin's life, and I will not let anything happen to Benjamin." And it's really a big character turn in Judah from what we saw earlier on in the story. Remember, Judah is the one who says, "Hey, guys, let's sell Joseph into slavery," right? That Judah was the instigator on that. And then the next chapter, we saw Judah is the one who was sleeping with his daughter-in-law and doing all these vile things. He was a terrible, terrible character in the beginning. Now here we see maybe at this point it's self-preservation because he recognizes they don't have any other point. He says, "We're all going to die if we don't do this." But he is starting to show a willingness now to lay down his life on behalf of his younger brother and on behalf of his father, who would be heartbroken if he was to lose his younger brother. So Jacob listens here, and they give us a hint here that something might be a little bit different about Judah. Now, Joseph prepares differently for them this time as they come back down into Egypt. Judah convinces Jacob to send Benjamin, and then what Joseph does is he feasts with his brothers. So before they even get there, he hears they're coming, and he prepares a feast. He's not speaking harshly to them initially. He is receiving them kindly and making a big feast for them. And they come back, and just to summarize, they say, "Hey, we found our money in our bags. We didn't steal it." And the household steward's like, "Yeah, you're good. You're cool. We put those there." Or he actually says God put them there, which is the same thing that they said whenever they said, "What has God done to us?" But then verse 26 of chapter 43, it says, "When Joseph came home, they brought into the house to him the present that they had with them, and bowed down to him to the ground. And he inquired about their welfare, saying, 'Is your father well, the old man of whom you spoke? Is he still alive?' They said, 'Your servant, our father, is well. He is still alive.' And they bowed their heads and prostrated themselves." It keeps on saying that they are bowing down to Joseph. It's really reiterating this is happening. They keep on bowing down to Joseph. "And he lifted up his eyes, and he saw his brother Benjamin, his mother's son. And he said, 'Is this your youngest brother of whom you spoke to me? God be gracious to you, my son.'" Very, very different reception of Benjamin than his older brothers, right? He is saying, "God be gracious to you," versus his older brothers that he was treating harshly. Then Joseph hurried out, for his compassion grew warm for his brother, and he sought a place to weep. And he entered his chamber, and he wept there. Then he washed his face and came out, and controlling himself, he said, "Serve the food." And they served him by himself, and them by themselves, and the Egyptians who ate with him by themselves, because the Egyptians could not eat with the Hebrews, for that is an abomination to the Egyptians. And they sat before him, the firstborn according to his birthright, and the youngest according to his youth. And the men looked at one another in amazement. Portions were taken to them from Joseph's table, but Benjamin's portion was 5 times as much as theirs, and they drank and were merry with him. So Joseph here, he gets his brothers drunk. That's they became merry with them, as they drank until they were drunk with Joseph. And you see that a lot of the time in the Old Testament, where it's not explicitly viewed negatively that people are partying in some way. It's not a way of saying, yeah, it's cool, like we can go party and get drunk. It's just culturally they would have these sort of feasts where they're celebrating and they're getting drunk. But what it's pointing to here is there's compassion on behalf of Joseph, but also he's treating them favorably now. And they probably think we are in really, really good shape at this point. But then in 44 is where you see Joseph's real test of his brothers start to come. And he tests his brothers again. Chapter 44, verse 1, he commanded the steward of his house, fill the men's sack with food, as much as they can carry, put each man's money in the mouth of his sack, and put my cup, the silver cup, in the mouth of the sack of the youngest, with his money for the grain. And he did as Joseph told him. So he's sneaking this cup into Benjamin's sack, and this time he does have motives in sneaking stuff back into their sacks. And he's testing them again, and he sends them off in verse 3, and then shortly afterwards he sends people after them to come and catch them. And verse 6 says, when he overtook them, he spoke to them these words. They said to him, why does my Lord speak such words as these? Far be it from your servants to do such a thing. Behold, the money that we found in the mouth of our sacks we brought back to you from the land of Canaan. How then could we steal silver or gold from our Lord's house? Whichever of your servants is found with it shall die, and we also will be my Lord's servants. And he said, let it be as you say. He who is found with it shall be my servant, and the rest of you shall be innocent. Then each man quickly lowered his sack to the ground, and each man opened his sack, and he searched, beginning with the eldest and ending with the youngest, and the cup was found in Benjamin's sack. Then they tore their clothes, and every man loaded his donkey, and they returned to the city. So Benjamin is the one guy that it could not be found in. He is the one guy that they could not say, yeah, absolutely, whoever has this cup, he's going to die. Benjamin's the one guy that they absolutely could not have let that happen to. And so now they have to return back to Egypt and get this sorted out. And they're devastated. They come before Joseph, freaking out about what Joseph is going to do. He speaks harshly again. It's interesting. He says, this is a cup from which Joseph practices divination. And then whenever they come to Joseph, he says, what deed is this you have done? Do you not know that a man like me can indeed practice divination? What that's talking about here is there was a practice in Mesopotamia that was a huge practice at this time. In fact, I read something that in terms of Akkadian literature there is more literature about the practice of divination than anything else in Akkadian literature. It's this massive practice that they did. And what this is most likely talking about is they would use oil or some sort of liquid along with water, and they would put the liquid in, and they would read what direction the liquid goes and kind of how it moves through the water. It's like palm reading or something like that. They would just like look at how it is. Is this saying that Joseph is a guy who is sitting there doing that? I don't think so, because later in the law, which is also written by Moses, who is writing this, later in the law, it explicitly forbids practicing divination. It explicitly says this is not a practice of the Hebrews. I think here Joseph is ramping up the stakes for his brother. I think he is. I think he's testing them again, and he's making them more and more concerned, because this is not only the cup that he practices divination in, but also this guy's got some kind of crazy power that he's able to divine these things. And I don't think, personally, there's nothing that says explicitly either way in this, but I don't think we see Joseph as a person who's actually practicing this thing that the law is going to forbid in just a couple books later. But he is testing his brothers again, and they fall before him. He accuses them, and then notice in verse 16, who is it that steps up? Whenever they are standing before Joseph again here, in verse 16, it says, and Judah said. It's not Reuben. It's not any of these other brothers who have been there. It's Judah who now steps up. And he says, what can we say to you, my Lord? What shall we speak? Or how can we clear ourselves? God has found out the guilt of your servants. Behold, we are my Lord's servants, both we and he also in whom the hand has been, in whose hand the cup has been found. But he said, far be it from me that I should do so. Only the man in whose hand the cup was found shall be my servant. But as for you, go up in peace to your father. So Joseph here pushes this test even further. He gives them an out. He says, look, just give me Benjamin. Just give up your youngest brother. Send your youngest brother down into Egypt, and y'all can go back to your father, and everything's going to be good. He's offering them that same opportunity that they had with Joseph 20-something years ago. And Judah is not going to give in this time. What we see next is actually the longest speech by a human character in the book of Genesis. So this is the longest kind of uninterrupted speech that is given. And anytime you're reading the Bible and you see the Bible pause on something and give it more time than other things, pay attention to it, because you think about it, just even practically speaking, they're writing this on scrolls, or they have limited room. They can't do Microsoft Word where they're just like typing and typing and typing and they can say whatever they want to forever. They have a limited amount of space to write these things. And so whenever they give more time to something, they're doing that intentionally. They are saying, like, this is worth my scroll time. Like, this is worth the space that I have on this scroll to write it. That's especially true in the New Testament when you look at, like, epistles. Epistles are small things. If they camp out on one subject for a long time, you need to pay attention to that. Same thing with the book of Acts. I'm teaching the students Acts on Sunday nights, and you see 3 times in the book of Acts it tells the story of Paul's conversion. And it goes through the entire story of his conversion 3 times. And that is, it could be seen as a waste of paper for the writer of Acts. But instead, I think it's an intentional thing that he is focusing in on this thing. And so here we see Judah give this long speech. And it's an intentional thing to say there's something really important here. So verse 18, then Judah went up to him and said, O my Lord, please let your servant speak a word in my Lord's ears, and let not your anger burn against your servant, for you are like Pharaoh himself. My Lord asked his servant, saying, have you a father or a brother? And we said to my Lord, we have a father, an old man, and a younger brother, the child of his old age. His brother is dead, and he alone is left of his mother's children, and his father loves him. Then you said to your servants, bring him down to me, that I may set my eyes on him. We said to my Lord, the boy cannot leave his father, for if he should leave his father would die. Then you said to your servants, unless your youngest brother comes down with you, you shall not see my face again. And when we went back to your servant, my father, we told him the words of my Lord. And when our father said, go again, buy us a little food, we said, we cannot go down. For if our youngest brother goes with us, then we will go down. For we cannot see the man's face unless our youngest brother is with us. Then your servant, my father, said to us, you know that my wife bore me 2 sons. My wife bore me 2 sons. Not these other 10 sons. He's not even thinking about them. My wife bore me 2 sons. One left me, and I said, surely he has been torn to pieces, and I have never seen him since. If you take this one also from me, and harm happens to him, you will bring down my gray hairs in evil to Sheol. Now therefore, as soon as I come to your servant, my father, and the boy is not with us, then as his life is bound up in the boy's life, as soon as he sees that the boy is not with us, he will die. And your servants will bring down the gray hairs of your servant, our father, with sorrow to Sheol. For your servant became a pledge of safety for the boy to my father, saying, if I do not bring him back to you, then I shall bear the blame before my father all my life. Now therefore, please let your servant remain instead of the boy, as a servant to my Lord, and let the boy go back with his brothers. For how can I go back to my father if the boy is not with me? I fear to see the evil that would come to my father. So, this is not the same Judah that we saw in chapters 37 and 38. This is a Judah that is now saying, I can't possibly do this to my brother, and I can't possibly do this to my father. Who are the two people that he offended so badly in chapter 37? He sells his brother into slavery. He has no concern about his brother's well-being. And not only that, he knows that he's the favorite of his father. He knows this is going to be devastating to his father, and he sells him off into slavery. He doesn't care about the well-being of his brother. He doesn't care about the well-being of his father. But here, Joseph is offering himself for the preservation of his brother and for the preservation of his father. Judah is willing to sacrifice himself to help his brother. And not only that, but Judah is concerned about the whole family here. He offered initially, like, let all the brothers stay here, but ultimately he's saying, I'm going to be the one who's going to stay here. So now I have forgotten to hit next on this. Judah steps up to save his brother. Judah is willing to sacrifice himself to help his brother and to please his father. So we see this massive shift in the character of Judah. And I also think that points us to a descendant of Judah that we are going to see later on. We know that from Judah comes David, from David ultimately comes Jesus. And Jesus is the one who is willing to step in and lay down his life for his brothers. He's the one who is willing to come in for the preservation of God's people, to give himself up for them. And I think you start to see Judah shift into that role here. We're still seeing that person be Joseph through the rest of the Joseph narrative. But then towards the end of Genesis, we're going to start to see that actually spoken into Judah's life. So before I jump into chapter 45, any questions on any of that? I know we just read a bunch and stuff. Yes. No, I think I skipped that part. He releases Simeon to them at some point in this. I think the first time when they come back down before they leave with Benjamin, Simeon's back with them. I just skipped that part. Yeah, it's probably would have been smart. They've not shown themselves to be the most thoughtful of people in the story. Yeah. I think they were hightailing it out of there. They might have been hungover also. That's also a possibility. I don't know what the brothers would have thought. But they have no reason not to. The interesting thing is, if you read all of this, it's no one is concerned. The brothers don't make any mention, and even Joseph doesn't make any mention of whoever has stolen this cup from me is going to die. It always says whoever's mouth, the mouth of the sack where it was found, whoever's sack it was, that's who's going to die, which is not necessarily the best way of judging who actually stole the cup from them. So I think in all of it, and Benjamin would be like, I didn't do anything. But yeah, ultimately the emphasis is Joseph's testing them, and even Joseph is not concerned with if someone stole it, because Joseph knows that no one stole it. It's funny too, the guy in all of these stories is the steward of Joseph, who's just doing all these things for Joseph, like these weird, like, why do you want me to put this cup? Why are you going to tell me to run after these guys? You put the cup in. And he's just, he's going and doing whatever his master says. It's interesting. Any other questions on that? All right, so Genesis 45. I mentioned Genesis 45 whenever we were in 37 because it's kind of Joseph's interpretation of chapter 37 and what happened. But let's look at it a little more closely now. says, then this is coming right off of Judah's speech, right? This is coming right off of Judah now showing a completely transformed character, acting completely differently than he did the day that he sold Joseph into slavery. And it says, then Joseph could not control himself before all those who stood by him, and he cried, make everyone go out from me. So no one stayed with him when Joseph made himself known to his brothers. And he wept aloud so that the Egyptians heard it. And the household of Pharaoh heard it. And Joseph said to his brothers, I am Joseph. Is my father still alive? But his brothers could not answer him, for they were dismayed at his presence. So Joseph here, he's weeping because he's recognizing Judah's change of heart. But all the brothers of Joseph aren't like, oh, good, we had this change of heart, and that's good. No, they are terrified because they realize who this guy is. And imagine being his brothers. Imagine that 20 years earlier, you have ruined a guy's life by selling him into slavery, and now here he is, basically the ruler of Egypt, ready to do whatever he wants to with you. That would be dismaying. And this is a complete side note that is not relevant, but I think it's interesting to think about. I think about Jesus' disciples whenever I read this story. Think about Jesus' disciples when they abandoned him on the night of his betrayal. So Judas betrays him, and his disciples flee. Peter denies him 3 times. They are nowhere to be found as he's being falsely accused, as he's being crucified, and all of this. They are completely unfaithful and completely gone. And then 3 days later, Jesus is alive, and he appears to them. And you see that story in Matthew chapter 28 where it says he comes to his disciples, and in verse 17 of chapter 28 of Matthew, it says they worshiped him, but some doubted. And you see that word doubted translated as doubted there. It's a word that means they gave pause. Some of them hesitated. Some of them were not like immediately just like running after Jesus. And I can't help but think how much of that is the disciples of Jesus abandoned him, and now this guy who has victory over death and the grave is now alive, standing before them. That could have been a terrifying thing. That could have been something that would cause someone to give pause. But ultimately, the response of Jesus is the same as the response of Joseph that you see here, that Jesus extends forgiveness to his disciples even though they abandoned him, even though they denied him, and he shows them an incredible grace. And you see the same thing happening here with Joseph. In verse 4, Joseph said to his brothers, come near to me, please. And his brothers are like, oh. But it says they came near, and he said, I am your brother Joseph, whom you sold into Egypt. And now do not be distressed or angry with yourselves because you sold me here. For God sent me before you to preserve life. Now, so first of all, you sold me into Egypt. He acknowledges that. He says, I am your brother that you sold into Egypt. You were the one doing that. It was your actions, your responsibility. This is what you were doing. He says, do not be distressed or angry. I would want my brothers to be distressed or angry with themselves. I mean, if they sold me, I would not have that kind of heart to say, don't worry about it, guys. No, I'd be like, yeah, you better feel bad because you sold me into slavery. But what you see in Joseph here is that his worldview is so shaped by his understanding of God's plan and of God's sovereignty that he is able to humbly reflect God's grace. The way that he is recognizing that God has been working a plan is now changing his heart and his actions so that he is behaving differently towards people around him. If he had no thought of God's big picture plan and no thought of how God was working through all these things, then he's probably an absolute jerk to his brothers in this moment and is probably exactly how I would be. But since he has this understanding of God's providence and that God is working this incredible plan for the preservation of his people, he's able to show grace. And he's humbling himself before the Lord again, like we talked about last week. Because God was in charge all this time. God was at work, and God was sovereign over all of this. Now, I want to point out just a few ways that he talks about God being sovereign in this. In verse 5, he says, "Do not be distressed or angry with yourselves, because you sold me here, for God sent me." So you see, again, this pairing of human responsibility, that you sold me here, with God's sovereignty. And it doesn't see these things as contradictory. It doesn't see that human beings being responsible for their sin and God acting and being in control and being sovereign. It doesn't see those as contradictory. It shows us that God is sovereign even when people are sinful. God was working his plan for the preservation of his people, even through the brothers who were being disobedient and were being sinful and were acting freely in sinful ways. God was still somehow sovereign. And when people are at their worst, God is still working his plan, and God is still showing grace. And Joseph, from that, realizes he can show grace. And so knowing that God is sovereign even when people are sinful, we can show grace to those who sin against us. That all the time people are sinning against us, and we are feeling the weight of other people's sin on our lives. And it is so easy for us to respond with, well, they need to get justice, right? Like they need to pay for what they've done. They need to feel the punishment for their sin because they've sinned against me. And yet that's not what you see the response of Joseph is here, because he recognizes God was doing his plan the whole time. And the movement that has in his heart is that he saw how God was working his grace, and so he turned himself and was showing grace. Knowing that God is in control and is working his plan allows us to not have to respond to evil with retaliation. It allows us to know, no, God's got something he's working in the end. God is doing something good, and we can trust in that, and we can show grace. And I think about, so there have been times I love football, and I love watching football games. Every once in a while, I'll miss a football game that I wanted to watch. And even I'm not the kind of person who's going to like shut everything out, not learn the score. I'll learn. Someone will say, yeah, so and so won that football game. But there's some football games that I'm like, I want to go back and watch it anyway, even though I know the end of the score, the end score. And understand, like, knowing the ending of the game changes how I watch that game. When something bad happens in the game to the team that I want to win, it's not like, oh no, what's going to happen? Because I know the final score. If my team won, then I'm good. And it changes the way that I respond to that. And I think the same thing is true for us as we live this life. We know God is working something good, right? We know the end of the story of history is that God is redeeming his people, and God is saving a people for himself. God is preserving people, no matter how bad it looks at the moment. And that changes how we approach things in our lives, even when people are sinning against us. That's the kind of life that we can live as Christians, knowing that ultimately it's going to lead to God's people in God's place under God's rule, and we can rest in that. Because not only is God sovereign through the actions of sinful people, but he's sovereign over the salvation of his people. If you look in verse 6, for the famine has been in the land these 2 years, and there are yet 5 years in which there will be neither plowing nor harvest. And God sent me before you to preserve for you a remnant on earth, and to keep alive for you many survivors. Notice who is doing the action here. God is doing the action. God sent me before you. Who actually sent Joseph into Egypt? I mean, it seems like his brothers, right? Or maybe the Ishmaelites who they sold him to. But this is saying that the person who was doing the action here was God. God was working, even in the cruelty of his brothers. Why? What is the point? to preserve for you a remnant on earth and to keep alive for you many survivors. That word remnant, if you read all of the Old Testament, is a big deal. That word remnant is going to get called back much later whenever they are taken off into exile by Assyria and Babylon. And it talks about there being a remnant that God is going to preserve. Remember those parallels between Daniel and Joseph here. And that promise that God was doing something good to preserve a remnant that they might go back into the land is a big deal here. God was doing this to save his people. What if Joseph never goes down into Egypt and his brothers don't sell him into slavery? And there's no one there to interpret Pharaoh's dream that there's going to be a famine. So there's no one there during that 7 years of plenty to store up the grain that is going to be enough for them to eat. So then when the famine comes, all of Jacob's families up there in Canaan, they run out of food. There's nowhere to go. There's no food. They can't live. Remember, that's one of the threats to the descendant of the woman that is going to come, is this famine that keeps on coming over and over again. But God sent Joseph. God took Joseph to Egypt actively for the purpose of saving his people. And you see that all over the book of Genesis and all over the Bible. And if you point it back to Abraham as well, you see this big picture story where God is going to use the descendants of Abraham so that all the nations of the world would be blessed. Why Abraham? Well, because God went to Abraham, and God chose Abraham, and God decided, this is going to be how I save my people. It's going to be through the descendants of Abraham. It's going to be through the sons of Jacob. It's going to be through the salvation of Joseph, so that much later on we are going to see Jesus, who is going to preserve life in a much more abundant way. So God is working this powerful plan to preserve his plan of salvation, so that Joseph says in verse 8, so it was not you who sent me here, but God. That's how much he is putting the onus on God in this story. It wasn't you. Y'all didn't, you may have sold me into slavery, but ultimately it was God who was sending me here. He made me a father to Pharaoh and lord of all his house and ruler over all the land of Egypt. Hurry and go up to my father and say to him, thus says your son Joseph, God has made me lord of Egypt. Come down to me and do not tarry. In each of our lives, God is working sovereignly to preserve life, but big picture, to preserve life through his ultimate eternal salvation. And so from that, we can rest in his plan. Even in these times when people are sinning against us, even in those times when we ourselves are sinning and we are feeling our failure and we are recognizing that we cannot possibly live up to the standard of God, we can still rest in God's plan of salvation for us, because he is the one who is working it. And it is not something that we can of our own selves work on our own. You see this several other places. We're seeing it right now in Romans 8 as Dr. York preaches through Romans 8, which is really amazing. In Ephesians 2 and Ephesians 1 as well, you see that God is, when we were dead in our sins, God made us alive together with Christ. Did we make ourselves alive? No, we're not making ourselves. God made us alive together with Christ. You see it in Acts chapter 17 whenever Paul is talking to the Athenians, and Paul says that God has ordained the times and places and the boundaries of people's dwelling places. God is the one who is working this big plan of where people are going to live at what time, so that this and this and this and this happens. And he's doing all of that in a way that is simultaneously, it's compatible with the idea that, yeah, Joseph's brothers should not have sold him into slavery, right? People are going to be held responsible for their actions, and yet God is working this sovereign plan. There is no peace in this life like sitting back in the hands of the Almighty God and knowing that he is in charge, and that he has a plan, that he is doing something good. And we think so many times that we can find rest and we can find peace by having control and by holding control over our own lives, that we are self-determining and that we are the ones that guide our fate. But there's so much more peace in putting trust in God's plan, because the tighter we hold on to control over our lives, the more that we're going to see our plans make us anxious, and the more overwhelmed we'll become because we cannot handle control over our lives. We need to have the sovereign God to lean back and trust in this life. We can really find peace in that. So one last thing here that we see, and we're going to talk about this much more next week, but we see that God sovereignly provides bountifully for his people. So talking next week, we're going to see that God doesn't just let his people survive. God doesn't just barely let them get by and then, send them back to Canaan. God overwhelms them with blessing in the land of Egypt and puts them in an incredible place of blessing, and they have more than they could possibly need. And God, we need to learn from this that God is not just finding a way for us to scrape by. It might feel like that in the moment. It might feel like God is just helping me get to the next moment of this day. But in God's big picture plan, God is finding a way to bountifully provide for us and to bountifully give us far more than we could ever ask or imagine. And we can rest in that. We can show grace to others because of that. And we can put our hope in the sovereign God with that.